Most people grow up believing that love inside a family is unconditional, that no matter how much you fall short or how different you turn out to be, your blood would shield you from being unloved. Landon stopped believing that long ago. In his house, love was a transaction, given only when you performed the part they wrote for you, and Landon, with his soft voice, creative mind, and heart that dared to love differently, was never the son Mr. Bryant had asked for. From the moment Landon could string memories together, he lived under the unspoken shadow of expectation. Mr. Bryant, his father, carried the family name like a crown forged from old traditions. In his mind, a son was supposed to be tough, stoic, someone who would marry a woman, have sons of his own, and continue the line just as it had been for generations. Landon, gentle and quietly brilliant, became the first crack in that ancient brittle crown. At first, the rejection was subtle, praise that never came, proud glances reserved for other people's sons. Little comments about real men dropped like knives into everyday conversations. Margaret, Landon's mother, tried to soften the blows, standing between her son and the towering shadow of a man who couldn't see beyond his own pride. But even she couldn't erase the way Landon was made to feel like a placeholder, not a true heir. Life carried on strained and brittle until the tragedy that would finally break whatever was left of their fragile facade. Landon's uncle, Mr. Bryant's younger brother, died suddenly in a car accident. The shock rolled over the family like a tidal wave, leaving silence and shattered routines in its wake. They traveled back to their hometown for the funeral, a small, weathered town where generations of Bryants had lived and been judged under the same narrow rules. It was there, among the withered flowers and hushed prayers, that Landon saw the truth laid bare. As people gathered in mourning, Mr. Bryant wept, but not for his brother in the way one might expect. Between solemn handshakes and stiff hugs, Landon overheard words that made the hair on his arm stand up. His father, eyes still glistening with crocodile tears, was proposing something unthinkable to Margaret, that he should marry Harper, the young widow, barely in her 30s, to secure the family's future. Margaret's face had gone pale, her hands trembling so slightly that most wouldn't have noticed. But Landon noticed. He watched as his mother, who had spent years stitching herself back together after every invisible cut Mr. Bryant delivered, seemed to unravel in the span of a few sentences. Harper, overwhelmed and humiliated, could barely meet anyone's eyes. The funeral was supposed to be about grief, about saying goodbye. Instead, it became a theater of desperation, a man clinging to an outdated dream, blind to the wreckage he was creating. And for Landon, it was something else entirely. It was confirmation of the quiet fear he had carried for years, that in his father's eyes, he was not the future. He was a dead end. After the funeral, no one dared speak of it. Family members urged silence, whispering about appearances, respect, and letting it go for the sake of the family name. Margaret forced herself to smile at relatives she no longer trusted. Harper avoided gatherings altogether. And Landon, he tucked away the betrayal like a splinter under his skin, too deep to remove, too painful to forget. From that day on, the weight inside their home grew heavier. Margaret shrank into herself, wearing her grief like an invisible cloak. Bryant became more restless, more distant, always muttering about what must be done for the family. And Landon, caught between his mother's quiet despair and his father's looming expectations, realized that survival would mean more than just hiding who he was. It would mean choosing whether to quietly disappear or to one day somehow stand up and say enough. If you believe that family should be built on love, not conditions, join us at Heart Stories. Subscribe and be part of a community where every story matters, especially the ones they tried to silence. The days after the funeral stretched into a gray, endless haze. Landon watched the house grow quieter, heavier, like it had been draped in an invisible shroud that muffled every sound, and feeling Margaret move through the rooms as if they were hollow shells performing the necessary tasks of daily life. With mechanical grace, but no longer smiling, no longer humming under her breath like she once did. She had been wounded deeply, but there were no bandages for this kind of hurt. Landon tried to pretend for a while, pretended that if he kept his head down, if he stayed invisible enough, the rot he felt creeping through the walls wouldn't touch him. But every glance at his mother's empty eyes, every wordless dinner eaten under the oppressive silence, reminded him that pretending was just another form of surrender. It wasn't just grief over losing a brother-in-law or a family member. What broke Margaret was the undeniable realization that the man she had built her life around had revealed the depth of his selfishness at the worst possible moment. His proposal to Harper was not an aberration. It was a symptom of a truth she had been trying not to see for years. Mr. Bryant did not love in the way Margaret had once believed. He loved himself, his legacy, his name, his imagined dynasty, more than any living, breathing person around him. Margaret had poured decades into building a family with him, raising children, sacrificing dreams she once dared to whisper into the night. And now, when the scaffolding cracked, she saw that it had always been built on sand. Her health began to falter. Soon after the funeral, sleepless nights turned into sluggish days. Small, sharp headaches became constant companions. She lost weight. She forgot conversations almost immediately after they happened. She wept silently and violently into her pillow when she thought no one could hear. But Landon heard. He always heard. He noticed how she flinched when the phone rang, fearing it might be another message from the family, another reminder that her suffering had to remain hidden to protect appearances. He saw the way she stared blankly at the TV without watching it, or folded laundry she had already folded once before because she couldn't focus long enough to realize it. He heard the broken prayers she whispered into the darkness at night, asking for strength she no longer believed she had, Mr. Bryant. Meanwhile, resumed life as if nothing had changed. To him, the funeral and the scandal it nearly caused were temporary inconveniences, things to be brushed aside with time and forced smiles. He spoke more and more about duty, about legacy, about the cost of being a real man, words he never directed at himself but expected everyone else to bear for him. Margaret became little more than a ghost, at his side, tolerated when useful, ignored when inconvenient. Sometimes Landon would catch his father looking at him with a mixture of disdain and disappointment, and so raw it made his stomach twist. In those moments, Landon understood something brutal to Mr. Bryant. He was not a son. He was an obstacle, a dead end in a bloodline that was supposed to go on forever. Margaret tried to fight back in small ways at first. She resisted when Mr. Bryant suggested more family gatherings to reassert control over the gossip. She refused to visit Harper after it became clear she was being harassed into marriage proposals she never invited. But every act of resistance cost her dearly, draining the little reserves of strength she had left. And Landon, standing helplessly on the sidelines, realized that his mother was bleeding out emotionally in slow motion. And no one, least of all her husband, intended to save her. One night, not long after Margaret had suffered a particularly brutal breakdown, Landon sat outside on the back steps, staring up at a sky smeared with indifferent stars. The air was thick, warm, almost suffocating. He felt trapped in a family that valued lineage over love, appearances over truth. The grief that clung to him wasn't just for his mother. It was for himself, too, for the version of his life that would never exist, the one where he could be gay and loved soft and strong without being seen as a threat. The next morning, Landon found Margaret in the kitchen, staring at a cup of cold coffee she hadn't touched. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes and offered a brittle smile, the kind that begged him not to notice how broken she was. Landon smiled back the way the survivors do when the fire is still burning around them, and there's no clear path to safety yet. He didn't know how or when, but deep inside, a small ember began to flicker in Landon's chest, a quiet, stubborn promise. He would not let the rot consume her. He would not let it consume him. A year passed, but the wounds that had been carved open never truly healed. Margaret wore her pain like a second skin, carefully stitched and hidden beneath polite smiles for neighbors, intense Sunday visits to church. Landon learned to read the spaces between her words, the way her hands trembled slightly when Mr. Bryant's voice grew too loud, the way her gaze always drifted toward the door, as if calculating the possibility of escape. Mr. Bryant, for a while, seemed to settle into a grudging normalcy. He threw himself into work, attended community events with the mechanical charm he had always wielded like a weapon. For those watching from the outside, the Bryant family looked stable, even enviable. Only Landon and Margaret knew the truth, that it was all balancing precariously atop a fault line, one that could split open at any moment. The fracture came sooner than either of them expected. Without warning, Mr. Bryant took a sudden trip back to their hometown, a trip he didn't bother to explain. Not even to Margaret. Landon sensed something was wrong the moment he watched his father's car disappear down the driveway. There was an urgency in his movements, a sharpness in the air he left behind. Margaret tried to stay composed, but a gnawing fear hollowed out her chest. She spent that night pacing the living room like a trapped animal, answering every phone ring with a flinch. Landon sat silently on the staircase, listening to the floorboards creak under her restless steps, knowing in his bones that their already broken family was about to shatter completely. It didn't take long. 2 days later, the phone rang again, but this time it was Harper's voice on the other end. She was crying so hard that her words barely made sense at first. Landon watched from the hall as Margaret clutched the phone with both hands, her knuckles white, whispering desperate reassurances into the receiver. Harper had fled from Mr. Bryant's unexpected visit, locking herself in her sister's house after he tried to corner her into another twisted proposal. He had promised her security, comfort, and family name preservation. What he had really promised was captivity, a lifetime chained to a man who didn't know how to love anyone beyond himself. Margaret hung up the phone with trembling fingers and turned to find Landon already watching her. No words passed between them. They didn't need words anymore. The fear and fury were written plainly across both their faces. When Mr. Bryant returned that evening, he carried himself with the smug arrogance of a man who believed himself justified. He spoke of duty, of legacy, of the necessity of ensuring the family's survival. He didn't look at Margaret as he explained. He didn't even glance at Landon, as if he had already mentally erased them from the equation. To Mr. Bryant, Margaret's inability to bear another child was not a tragedy, but an inconvenience. To Mr. Bryant, Landon's very existence, soft-hearted, queer, and unwilling to perform the role assigned to him, was a failure he needed to correct. And Harper, young and vulnerable, was just a pawn in a game he refused to stop playing. Margaret broke down that night, not with screams or thrown objects, but with a silence so deep it scared Landon more than any rage ever could. She sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, shoulders shaking with the weight of it all. Landon stood in the doorway, fists clenched at his sides, fighting the helplessness that threatened to swallow him whole. He thought about the boy he used to be, the boy who tried to earn his father's approval with good grades, perfect manners, invisible queerness. He thought about the nights he had spent wondering if being himself meant losing everything. And now he realized he had already lost the version of his family he once clung to. What remained was a crumbling house built on lies, powered by fear and control. For the first time, Landon felt something shift inside him. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a cold, clear understanding that pretending would no longer save them. That love, when conditional, when twisted by expectations and violence, was no love at all. Later that week, as Landon walked past his father's office, he caught a glimpse of Mr. Bryant on the phone, his voice low and urgent. He didn't need to hear the words to know they were poisoned. His father wasn't done. He would keep pushing, keep threatening, keep reaching with greedy hands for something he thought he was owed. Landon knew then that silence was no longer an option. Not if he wanted to save his mother, not if he wanted to save himself. He didn't yet know what form his rebellion would take, but the choice had already been made. The house seemed colder after that night, as if even the walls had finally grown tired of pretending. Margaret drifted through the days like a woman caught between realities, her soul tethered to memories of a life she no longer recognized. Mr. Bryant, on the other hand, carried on as though nothing had changed. He sat at the head of the table each evening, commanding silence with his presence, stacking obligations and expectations like a man building a fortress from dust. Landon moved through this broken world carefully, silently, but inside him something sharp and restless had taken root. He couldn't look at his father without feeling the weight of 100 unspoken betrayals. He couldn't listen to his mother's quiet weeping without tasting the bitterness of helplessness. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, almost by accident. Mr. Bryant had left his office door ajar, a careless mistake in a household where carelessness had once been fatal. Landon had meant only to grab the keys to the garage, but something, perhaps instinct, perhaps the small voice inside that had been screaming for months, pulled his gaze toward the desk. The phone sat there, screen lit, buzzing softly with an incoming message. Landon hesitated, knowing the line he was about to cross. Then he stepped forward. The message preview alone was enough to chill his blood. "You can't run forever, Harper. You owe this family. You owe me." His hands trembled as he unlocked the device, the passcode one he had known for years, but had never dared to use until now. What he found inside was worse than anything he had imagined. Thread after thread of messages, threats thinly veiled as reminders, promises laced with menace, photos of Harper taken without her knowledge attached like trophies, a twisted narrative carefully built, a record of months of pressure, harassment, and control. Landon's throat tightened, bile rising. Every shred of hope that maybe somehow he had misunderstood who his father had become dissolved in an instant. Mr. Bryant was not just selfish, he was dangerous, and he was escalating. Landon copied everything: screenshots, emails, voice recordings, stored deep in hidden apps. He transferred them to a secure folder on his own device, hands moving mechanically, even as his mind screamed at the enormity of what he was doing. He didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in the dark, listening to the hollow creaks of the old house, wondering how many other truths had been buried in its walls over the years. The next morning, Harper was gone. Not just from town, from everything. Her number disconnected, her apartment abandoned, her social media accounts wiped clean. It was as if she had evaporated under the weight of fear. Landon knew without needing to be told that it wasn't by choice. She had been driven away, cornered by the relentless, suffocating force that Mr. Bryant had wielded. With impunity for years, Margaret received the news with a devastation so complete it defied description. She collapsed into a chair, face-pale hands clutched to her chest as if trying to hold her heart inside. Landon sat beside her, helpless again, offering silent presence where words would have been meaningless. For days, Margaret barely spoke. She moved through the house like a shadow, unable to bear the sound of the phone ringing. The sight of Mr. Bryant's indifferent face, the reminders of how completely their lives had unraveled. Mr. Bryant never mentioned Harper again. He buried the scandal with the same ruthless efficiency he used to bury every other inconvenience. To the outside world, nothing had happened. Life continued. But inside the Bryant home, love, whatever was left of it, had turned to ash. Landon watched it all with a growing, searing clarity. He thought about the boy he used to be, who had once believed that survival meant silence. He thought about Margaret, who had given everything she had to a man who never truly saw her. He thought about Harper, forced to erase herself to escape the noose tightening around her life. And he thought about himself, about the years spent trying to be small enough, invisible enough, obedient enough to fit a mold he was never meant to fill. There was no fitting in anymore. No pretending that being the son his father wanted was possible. There was only truth now, and truth demanded a voice. As he stood in the empty kitchen one evening, staring at the flickering light above the sink, Landon felt the shape of his decision settle into place. It was terrifying, like standing on the edge of a cliff with no guarantee of what lay below, but it was also freeing. If silence was survival, then speaking was salvation. Not just for him, but for the mother who had loved him, even when she herself was too broken to fight. For Harper, whose escape had cost her everything. And for the boy he had once been, who deserved better than a lifetime spent hiding. He would not be complicit in the decay of their lives anymore. The reckoning was coming, and this time Landon would not whisper. The day Landon chose to speak did not arrive with thunder or fireworks. It came quietly, slipping into his life like a breath he had been holding for far too long. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind where sunlight fell heavy through the windows and the air inside the Bryant home felt too thick to breathe. Margaret sat silently at the dining table, a half-folded newspaper in front of her. Bryant, perched in his usual chair like a king over a crumbling kingdom, sipped coffee and pretended not to notice the hollow emptiness around him. Landon stood across the room, heart hammering against his ribs, the phone heavy in his pocket, carrying the evidence he had gathered, the proof of the rot no one else dared name aloud. He could have waited for a different moment, a more private confrontation, but he understood something now. Silence had protected Mr. Bryant long enough. Truth needed witnesses. He stepped forward. At first, Mr. Bryant barely looked up. Landon's voice, steady but trembling at the edges, forced him to, "I know what you did to Harper." Landon said each word, slicing the heavy air apart. "I have it all. The threats, the pictures, everything." For a moment, time froze. Mr. Bryant set his coffee down. Slowly, eyes narrowing, calculating. Margaret turned her head, confusion flickering across her tired features. Then horror as the meaning sunk in. "You've disgraced yourself," Mr. Bryant said, finally, his voice low, dangerous. "You and your mother should be grateful I've tolerated either of you this long." The words landed with the weight of a hammer. Once they might have broken Landon. "But not today, no," Landon said, his voice firm now. "You tolerated nothing. You destroyed everything that could have been good in this family because you couldn't accept anyone who didn't fit into your fantasy. I am your son, I always have been. And nothing you do, nothing you say, will ever change the fact that I exist, exactly as I am." Mr. Bryant stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. His face turned a shade darker, fists clenching at his sides. Landon didn't flinch. For the first time in his life, he met his father's anger with something stronger than fear, defiance born from truth. "You want a different son?" Landon continued, voice rising slightly. You'll have to build him from scratch because you've lost the one you had. He turned to Margaret, then offering her a hand. She hesitated, not because she didn't want to take it, but because she had been conditioned for so long to believe she had no right to leave. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a heartbeat, Landon feared she would sink back into the numb compliance that had kept her prisoner all these years. But then slowly she placed her hand in his. Without another word, they walked out the door, leaving behind the house that had once promised safety and instead delivered nothing but scars. Landon didn't look back. He knew there was nothing worth mourning inside those walls anymore. The world outside felt startlingly wide, terrifying in its openness, but it was real. It was theirs to reclaim. They spent that first night in a modest motel on the outskirts of town, the kind with flickering neon signs and scratchy sheets. Margaret cried herself to sleep, not from regret, but from the sheer exhaustion of survival. Landon sat beside her, staring out the window into the darkness, feeling a strange, fragile peace settle over him. They didn't have a plan. They didn't have money connections or certainty, but they had the truth. And for Landon, that was enough to build a life worth living. He thought about Harper, somewhere far away, rebuilding her life from the ruins left behind. He thought about himself, not the version Mr. Bryant had tried to mold, but the boy who loved freely, openly, without shame. Landon knew the road ahead would not be easy. Healing never was. But for the first time, the path he walked was one he chose, not a duty forced upon him, not a role he had to play. Just himself, at last. What about you? Have you ever had to walk away from a family that couldn't see who you truly were? Share your story in the comments. You never know who might find courage through your words. If you believe that real family is built on love, not control, subscribe to Heart Stories. Here, your story matters, your voice matters, and above all, you matter.